Kudrat Ki Jaan Mission 2100. Men create opportunity. Every great human achievement has been the result of individual effort, the practical development of a dream in the mind of an individual. Successful design is not the achievement of perfection, but the minimization and accommodation of imperfection. There is much to be done that no select or small portion of people can do. Only the greater mass of India will ensure the achievement of a nation. This can be done only with hard work and sacrifice. Every job is a challenge, but often it is the simplest challenge that gives you the sense of achievement when you finally pull it off. When you work with people, you buy into it. You work together and you pull together. It doesn't matter what your challenge is. There is always a sense of achievement at the end of it. Thomas Spencer graduated from the University of Western Australia with a Bachelor in English Literature and Philosophy. He has a Master of Science in Carbon Management from the University of Edinburgh, with a focus on energy economics and the public law of climate change. As Director of the Energy and Climate Change Program between 2013 and 2016, he co-authored influential publications on the arrangements of the Paris Agreement. He was a member of the Franco-Chinese Expert Group on Climate Change between 2013 and 2015 in order to contribute to both governments' preparations for COP21. He published on the impact of the US shale gas. He has studied the energy systems of 6 of the world's largest economies. Publishing on the issue of financial sector regulation and low-carbon investment, he researched the nexus between China's macroeconomic development and its emissions pathway. Thomas then moved to India and joined TERI, the Energy and Resources Institute, in 2017, where he works on the decarbonization of the Indian power sector and coordinates TERI's flagship program, the Energy Transitions Commission India, ETC India. Over the last 4 decades of its journey, TERI has emerged as one of the world's preeminent think tanks and research institutions in the field of energy, climate change, and sustainability. Let us go into the future of the world 80 years from now and listen to the climate expert in this segment of Anant Drishti, Kudrat Ki Jaan, Mission 2100.
So a very warm good afternoon to you all. Let me start by saying how much I have enjoyed the wonderful program that you have this afternoon. So inspiring, so uplifting, so nice to see the young children enjoying themselves and learning about other cultures. So it is really my great pleasure to be here. I've been working on this issue of climate change all of my professional career. I'm very passionate about it. I'm also very concerned about it, so I'm always happy to come and accept invitations to speak about this issue. And I do think that in a way the future is in all of our hands, but it is in particular also in India's hands, as one of the world's most populous countries, one of the world's fastest growing economies, and one of the countries with potentially the most to lose if we don't manage to address the issue of climate change. So I'm going to talk about 3 topics, very briefly, maybe 15-20 minutes. I hope I don't get too technical for you. I've studied this as a scientist all my professional career, so sometimes it's very easy to get into the technical details, but I hope to keep it at a level where we can all follow along, and to share some of my passion for this issue and some of my concern and some of my optimism as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the issue of climate change from the perspective of science. Is it open? Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about the issue of climate change from the perspective of science. I'm going to talk about our efforts to reach a global agreement on climate change that would allow countries to cooperate on the solutions. which I've been very much involved in my professional career. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what India is doing on the issue of climate change, and maybe end with a few words on what every individual can do. So, to start with the issue of the science of climate change, there is the perception that climate change is a new discovery, that we have only known about it for the last 10 years, the last 20 years. This is actually not correct. We have been building up our knowledge of the science of climate change for more than 200 years. So we can trace really the foundation of the science of climate change back to 1814, when the French mathematician Joseph Fourier calculated, with the best physics available at that time, an estimate of the Earth's energy balance. How much energy is coming in from the sun, how much is dissipating back into space, and therefore what the temperature of the Earth is. And he found with his calculations that the Earth was about 14 degrees warmer than his calculations implied. And then it took another almost 40 years before a British chemist called John Tyndall discovered that a gas in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide, has the physical property of being able to trap heat. And it is this gas, and a number of others, which trap heat in the atmosphere of the Earth. And it is this gas that causes that temperature differential that Joseph Fourier calculated. So we've known that there are gases in the atmosphere that trap heat, that warm the Earth, for more than 150 years. And people were already writing at the beginning of the 19th century articles questioning whether our burning of fossil fuels in industry, in power generation, in transport, could raise the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to levels where it could start to have an appreciable impact on the global climate. Fast forward to 1973, almost 50 years ago, and the US President commissioned a report from NASA looking into the issue of global climate change. And that report came to the conclusion that if we doubled the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we would warm the planet by roughly 1.5 degrees. That figure, even in all of the scientific advances that have occurred since then, has not really changed very much. So our understanding of climate change has been built up through many generations of work. Now, if you move on to the 1980s, in 1988, the World Meteorological Organization and the United Nations established what is called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is a small organization. It has a very small budget, and essentially its job is to provide the governments of the world every 5 or 6 years with a synthesis of the best available science on the issue of climate change. It doesn't do any new science, it just provides a synthesis of all the peer-reviewed articles, the data sets that have been gathered. The first one was produced in 1991. The last one was produced in 2 years, 2012 and 2013, because it has come to be an almost 1,200 page, 3-volume report that is presented, and a really huge scientific undertaking. Almost 6,000 scientists work on it for free. They don't receive any money. It is part of their academic jobs that they contribute. It goes through an extremely rigorous process of peer review. Any particular chapter of the report might receive up to 40 to 50,000 comments from peer reviewers. And then the authors of the report are obliged to respond one by one to each of those comments in their amendments to the chapters. I have worked on 2 assessment reports, and I can tell you it's an extremely time-consuming and rewarding process, but very, very difficult. So what is the IPCC telling us? As we have gone from 1991 to the last assessment report, the 5th assessment report, we have seen, number one, the level of certainty that human beings are raising the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and other greenhouse gases. That is now incontrovertible. We have long data sets going back to the 1950s with instrumental measures, and we have measures from ice cores in places like Greenland, which go back more than 1.5 million years. And if you drill down into the ice core, you can extract essentially the atmosphere as it was when the water froze. And so we know that 1.5 million years ago, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere was well below what it is today. So the pre-industrial level of CO2 in the atmosphere was about 280 parts per million. It is now 440. So it has gone up very significantly, almost double. The global temperature has risen on average by about 1 degree Celsius. The problem is that this warming is not equally shared around different parts of the world. So it has warmed much more in higher latitudes, for example in the Arctic, where the average temperature has gone up by about 3 to 4 degrees Celsius. And we have seen periods in recent years where the Arctic temperature was almost 15 to 20 degrees Celsius above the seasonal average, something that we have never seen before. So number one, it is absolutely incontrovertible that we are increasing the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. Number two, the science has become increasingly certain, and I would say is now as certain as science ever is, that this increase in CO2 in the atmosphere is leading to the observed warming of the Earth. We can see this warming in every single data set that you care to look at. In global average temperature, in the heat content of the oceans, in the extent of the snow cover in the northern latitudes, in the mass that is being lost in the ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland and so on. In the flowering of plants when they flower, in the migratory patterns of birds. Almost any data set that you care to look at shows a fingerprint of warming. And the science has become increasingly certain that we just have to rule out any other cause that we can think of. It is not the sun. The sun's irradiation, the amount of energy that is arriving to Earth has not changed over the last century. It's not volcanoes. Volcanoes actually cool the climate, they don't warm it. Any other factor that you might care to look at cannot explain the observed warming. So science, I would say, is as certain as science ever is that human beings are causing the observed warming. So much for where we are. Now, if we look at what does the future hold, if we project forward the current level of emissions with current trends in economic growth, in technology, in policy, we are heading to about 3 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century, and between 1 and 2 meters of sea level rise. We've already had 1 degree of Celsius warming, and we are seeing very serious consequences in many parts of the world, including from India. I'm Australian originally, although I lived in India with my wife, who is Indian, for 3 years. And if you look at the forest fires that have occurred in Australia, completely unprecedented amount of destruction of life, of property, and of an extremely vulnerable and sensitive ecosystem. The national average rainfall in Australia was 40% below the long-term average last year, and the national average temperature was 1.5 degrees Celsius above the average. This is what we would face on a yearly basis under about 2.5 degrees warming. We've lost almost 40% of the Arctic sea ice. So the Arctic sea ice is not an ice sheet, it floats on the water, and it melts in the summer and reconstitutes in the winter. But we have seen the volume of ice, the extent of ice, drop by almost 40% over the last 3 or 4 decades. We are seeing in India increasing variability, particularly in the Indian summer monsoon, on which so much of India's rain-fed agriculture depends. So 1 year underperforming monsoon, 1 year overperforming monsoon, extremes of rain in certain districts, and so on. Melting of the Himalayan glaciers, which feeds the river systems on which India depends, and temperature extremes of 50 degrees, 50 plus degrees on the Gangetic Plain. So the signs are very serious, and if we were to have 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century, 1 to 2 meters of sea level rise, it's pretty clear that we would be bequeathing to our children and grandchildren a planet that would ultimately look very different to the one that we live on, and potentially would be much less hospitable to human welfare and human civilization. Some of the things that scientists are very concerned about are so-called tipping points or discontinuities in the climate system. So for example, if temperatures start to rise, it is possible, and indeed it is already occurring, that large amount of permafrost, which is the permanently frozen soil in the northern latitudes in Russia and in Canada, would start to melt. That holds an enormous quantity of carbon that would then be exposed to oxidization and be emitted as CO2, potentially accelerating the warming. You have melting of Arctic sea ice. If you replace white ice with dark seawater absorbs much more heat than white ice, again accelerating warming. So scientists are very concerned about these tipping points in the climate system where we might experience non-linear change and potentially change that would accelerate the human-induced trend of global warming. So another one is the Indian summer monsoon. We're not exactly sure what would happen to the Indian summer monsoon under 2 degrees of warming. It's likely that the amount of precipitation that India receives would increase. We don't know exactly as climate scientists, but it's also likely that if the amount of precipitation that increases, that India receives increases, so would the variability. So you would have extreme years like we had last year, and then years of drought. So this is why scientists have said for some decades now that we need to limit warming below a certain threshold. And the threshold that has been identified is warming above pre-industrial average global climate of 2 degrees Celsius. So we're about halfway there already. They've identified that, for example, coral reefs, like the Great Barrier Reef, would suffer significant and potentially irreversible damage if warming occurred even to 2 degrees. Because coral reefs are extremely sensitive to temperature, but they're also extremely sensitive to the acidity of the ocean. And if the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increases, some of it is dissolved in the ocean, and it increases the acidity, lowers the pH of the ocean, inhibits the growth of coral and other ecosystems. So science has said we need to limit warming to below 2 degrees. And this is essentially the goal that was adopted by the Paris Agreement on Climate Change in 2015. So with that introduction to the science, I'll tell you a little bit about the global efforts to limit warming to less than 2 degrees. So we have to go back a little bit in time. The first report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that I mentioned was released in 1990. And then the governments convened and said, oh, this looks like a serious problem. We need to start to negotiate an international treaty on climate change. And they came up with what is called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was adopted at the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 and entered into force in 1995. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is a framework convention. It doesn't prescribe specific quantitative targets for the reduction in greenhouse gases. So right after it was negotiated, governments again came together and said, now that we have this framework convention which sets out a process and principles for us to collaborate, we need to negotiate specific emissions reductions. So they negotiated what was called the Kyoto Protocol in Kyoto in Japan in 1997, which came into force in 2005. The Kyoto Protocol set out quantitative absolute emissions reduction targets for developed countries, countries like Australia, Canada, the United States, European countries. It did not set any emissions limits on developing countries, and this is because they are historically less responsible for climate change. The vast quantity of excess carbon dioxide that has built up in the atmosphere has been emitted historically by the countries that were first to industrialize, so Europe and so on. The problem was with the Kyoto Protocol that the United States pulled out. They pulled out in 2001 when George Bush became president, because they said that it was not fair that the world have an agreement which didn't include developing countries, that it would damage their industry, that it would be ineffective. Since then, we have effectively been trying to negotiate an agreement that included both developed and developing countries. And we finally achieved that in the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which is an international treaty which has been ratified by more than 150 parliaments around the world, including India, and which sets out the target of limiting global warming to less than 2 degrees. It also sets voluntary but quantified emissions reduction targets for every country that is a party to it, including developing countries, so including countries like China and India. It sets out a principle of financial aid. For example, the developed countries promised annual support for climate change action in developing countries to the tune of $100 billion per year by 2020, so this year itself. So this was a tremendous achievement. I was on the French delegation that piloted those negotiations. It was extremely difficult to achieve. It's been a long process. It's been almost 20 years that we have been trying to negotiate an agreement on climate change. So if we were to limit warming to less than 2 degrees, essentially we would have to start reducing emissions now and reduce them pretty rapidly, and we would have to eventually reduce them to zero. This is because carbon dioxide is a very long-lived gas in the atmosphere, so you can think of it as essentially filling up a bath. The quantum of water in the bath is carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The tap is everything that human beings are putting into the atmosphere. If you don't want the bath to overflow, eventually you need to cut the tap to zero. The problem is that our whole model of economic and industrial development, which has brought so many benefits to the world in terms of reduction in child mortality, in terms of increase in lifespans, improved living standards and so on, is built on the use of fossil fuels. Our energy and industrial economy is built on the use of fossil fuels. Anything that you do in your life, whether you turn on the light, whether you cook a bati of rice, whether you drive your car, you take a plane, it's based on fossil fuels. So the challenge that we have before us, and why I think this mission 2100 is such an appropriate title for this suggestion, for this session, is essentially to build a global, developed, equitable society by 2100 that uses other energy sources, other industrial processes than those which currently emit fossil fuels. This is a tremendous challenge. I don't want to hide from I've been studying this for now 15 years. It is going to be extremely difficult to do. It is above all going to be extremely difficult to do because we have very little time. The bath is almost half full, the tap is on. We don't have much time to turn it off. So now that we have this framework for cooperation, which is called the Paris Agreement, let me tell you a little bit about what India is doing. When we say what India is doing, let's be clear. India is still a relatively poor country. Its GDP per capita is maybe 1/10 of the United States. Its emissions per capita are about 7 times lower than the United States. Slightly less than 2 tons of CO2 per capita in India, slightly more than 16 tons of CO2 per capita in the United States. So I feel it was quite exceptional, courageous by Prime Minister Modi and his government that they signed on to the Paris Agreement and that they undertook some very ambitious targets under the Paris Agreement. But I think it is also a measure of how well the government has understood how vulnerable India is to climate change and how much it needs to be a part of the solution. So India has promised that it would increase the renewable energy capacity of its electricity generating capacity to 175 gigawatts. That might not mean anything to you, but if it was achieved by the year 2022, the share of wind and solar in total power generation in India would increase from about 3% about 3 or 4 years ago to about 20% in 2022. This is a transformation the like of which no country of India's GDP per capita, of India's still low level of development, has ever achieved. We currently have about 80 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity installed. So we are roughly halfway, and the pace of growth in the sector is truly impressive. We've seen prices for renewable energy drop from about, for solar in 2010, about 2 rupees per kilowatt hour. So 12 rupees per kilowatt hour, 12 rupees per unit, as you say, down to about 2.5 rupees per unit, 2.5 rupees per kilowatt hour. Wind is also at about 2.5 to 3 rupees per kilowatt hour. So at this price, essentially renewables are now cheaper than coal in India. The National Thermal Power Corporation is the largest generating company in India. It's owned by the central government. It has large coal-fired power plants. The weighted average tariff that it offers to Indian consumers is 3.7 rupees per kilowatt hour. So we can now generate wind and solar cheaper than we can generate electricity from coal. So India is really driving forward a quite dramatic transformation in its electricity sector, and that is very positive. Our expectation is that within the next 10 to 20 years, India could be achieving half of its electricity from wind and solar. But that obviously is not the start at the end of the story. We have emissions in other sectors, like in transport, in industry, in our building sectors, in our homes, and here we also need a lot of significant policy action so that we can start to shift away from fossil fuels and onto low carbon sources of energy. We will need a lot of innovation. We will need prices to come down for alternative technologies. We will need financial help from the developed world to implement some of these new technologies in a country like India. And we will need continued global cooperation. This is why it's so concerning, for example, that the United States, after having pulled out of the Kyoto Protocol because they said it didn't include developed countries, has now pulled out of the Paris Agreement because they say India and China are not doing enough. I personally consider this a tragedy, and maybe future generations will look at it like a crime against humanity. But when you have the world's largest economy, a technological superpower, it really weakens the strength of global cooperation to have them pulling out. So the final word that I would leave you with, I hope this has given you an interesting panorama, maybe a sobering one, but I live and work with a lot of hope. I have seen things change in the short time that I have been working on it, a lot. Things have changed extremely fast. But my message is to you, there is a critical role for a country like India. The role that its government played in helping the French stitch together the Paris Agreement, the vision of Prime Minister Modi was really tremendous. And without that strong role from China, from India, from Europe, I'm very concerned that we will not be able to manage the problem. So I hope this has been interesting for you. Let me say just a couple of things what we can do every day in our lives. Indians actually live very frugal lives. We don't eat as much meat as in the West. We don't consume as much resources. We tend to live in much more densely packed apartments and so on. So if you look at resource consumption per capita relative to GDP per capita, for example, India is actually a tremendously resource efficient economy already. But there is, of course, lots that we can do. We can look at installing solar in our own homes. We can look at improving the energy efficiency of our own homes. We can look at the education of the young. We can look at the education of those around us in our community. We can look at reforestation, which India is doing a lot of because of the risks of land degradation and desertification. But above all, and this is a message that I give you ambiguously with a bit of sadness, if everyone does a little bit, only a little bit will get done. We need big systemic change. And that is something that only governments can do. Only corporations can do. Only they can set the policies that will really drive a systemic change. So we also need to start voting in a democracy on the issue of environment, so that governments get the message that they need to continue to act. In India, I think air pollution is becoming an issue for the democracy, a voting issue for the people. Hopefully over time the issue of climate change will as well. So thank you very much. I hope it has been interesting, not too depressive.
Kudrat Ki Jaan, Mission 2100. Happiness doesn't come from doing easy work, but from the achievement of a difficult task that demands our best. The Rotary Excellence Award is conferred upon Thomas Spencer for his understanding of climatic change